Jack Mintz sees a Canadian tax system that penalizes single-earner families. He says it's unfair, and he lays out an alternative that would allow families to split their incomes for tax purposes. And here now with more, Jack Mintz, author of the University of Calgary report, No More Second-Class Taxpayers, How Income Splitting Can Bring Fairness to Canada's Single-Income Families. And we welcome you back. Can I say welcome back home?
Oh, well, you could say that for sure. I'm back here in Toronto quite often.
Okay. You've been in Calgary 5.5 years, though, but you're from here.
Yes, well, actually, I'm originally from Alberta, but I've been in Ontario 30 years.
Very long time, yeah. Well, before we get to your proposal, I want you to explain to us why you think the federal tax system as it currently exists is unfair to single-earner families. How come?
Well, this principle really goes back to the famous Carter Report of 1966, arguing for family taxation. But it's basically the issue is we have progressive income taxes in Canada, like many other countries. And as a result, if you have a single earner, they'll end up paying more tax than a dual earner family. So for example, at $70,000 in income, a single earner will pay about 30% more in federal tax than a dual earner family, let's say each making $35,000 for a total of $70,000.
How has that been allowed to develop over the years?
Well, I think in Canada we started off with individual income taxation, and over the years actually we've adopted various aspects of family taxation. For example, all the refundable credits like the GST credit and the child tax benefits are clawed back based on family income. We also allow spouses to contribute to an RSP of another spouse. We now have pension income splitting. And it's pretty easy for many people, if they can organize their business affairs, that they can actually end up splitting income with their spouses through a corporate structure. But in the case of people who work, we don't allow such income splitting, and I think that's been an issue that's been hotly debated in many countries. A number of countries do have family taxation, others don't.
How come, or should I say, how far back has this disparity existed?
A very long time.
Decades?
Decades, because in fact, maybe even worse, because we had a more progressive rate structure, going back pre-1972 days when we had a major tax reform at that time.
Do single-earner families have any advantages over dual-income families?
Well, there are some, and it's important to keep that into account. One of the most important things is that when you have a spouse staying at home, they have what's called, economists might call home production. Things that they do at home, whether it's keeping the house in order or growing carrots in the vegetable garden, whatever. And there's a value to the time that they have, and that's not subject to taxation. At least no government has yet figured out how to make that subject to taxation. And so that does give them an advantage in that they can enjoy more home production as a single earner family compared to a dual earner family, where a dual earner family may have to hire more people or do things in order to compensate for that.
Okay, so let's figure out, we have a lot of younger people who watch this program who may not be paying too much personal income tax at the moment, or who may not be married. So let's talk about just what income splitting means as it relates to your plan.
Well, income splitting means taking some income of the single earner and being able to transfer it to the other member of the family.
Who may not be making anything.
Right, so it's like deducting income for the single earner and then putting income in the hands of the other earner who then reports more income, and it's subject to tax. And what it does is it evens out the amount of tax, and so it looks like more like a dual earner family that's subject to taxation.
And if you do that, the family as a whole pays less tax, yes?
Oh, that's right. So, for example, the Conservative government the current Conservative government had made an election pledge to allow for the transfer of $50,000. So let's say you're at a rate of, let's say, 40% is the top rate for a single earner family in Ontario. That's not the top rate, but let's say that is the rate at which that family is being subject to tax. And if it transfers the income to a spouse that doesn't have any income, $50,000, that income will be then subject to a little more than 20% tax. So you would save, approximately $10,000 in tax totally by making that transfer of $50,000.
I've also heard Jim Flaherty say while he likes the idea, there is a cost attached to this, meaning his treasury will realize less income. which presumably gives him less money to spend on programs that he wants, etc. Any idea how much, if you fully implemented this, it would cost?
Well, their estimate was $2.5 billion. Another study suggested 2.7. So I think that gives you a fair idea. But that's their particular proposal. In fact, the proposal that I made with my colleague Matt Kapusky has a twist to it, which actually will have less cost associated with it.
Well, let's bring up the graphs first. We've got a couple of graphics we can show here, and you can walk us through these, and then we'll figure out more of what you're talking about here. So control room, if you would. Okay, first graph. Here's the federal tax burden, creating tax equity, we're calling this. And you can see the dual earner is the red line, and the single earner is the blue line. And obviously the single earner is paying more federal tax at the moment. Let's flip this board over and show the next one, which shows a tax burden with income splitting. And the two lines are virtually, I say, identical. And again, the significance of the difference between the two graphics here is?
Just doing that split of $50,000 in income for those families. We used a special model that takes into account not just all the income taxes, but also the various clawbacks of the income tested benefits and things like that.
Is there anything ideological about income splitting?
Oh, I think so. Some people argue, well, you really should treat spouses differently in a family, that you shouldn't even think about a family in terms of taxation. So there's that kind of argument. Also, we only argue it for limiting income splitting to those people who have children. And so some people would argue, well, why don't we allow income splitting for more categories? I would suggest the main reason for some limitation is really a revenue reason, that you want to kind of keep the fiscal cost a bit at least handled. And I think the real serious issue has to do with the choice that spouses make about whether they should go into the workforce, both of them, or one of them decide to stay home and raise children during that period.
Now, referring to Jim Flaherty again, I think I remember him saying he was keen on the idea, but not until the budget was balanced. The budget's a long way from balanced. I know they say they're going to have it balanced by 2015, but I'm not sure. Okay, you're a good economist. They're going to have the budget balanced by 2015?
Well, it's not that big of a deficit. It's moving down. And so it is possible to balance by 2015, depending on how the economy will do. And frankly, I don't think any economist is very good at forecasting anyway these days. But I do think that there is an opportunity to potentially balance a budget by that time.
And do income splitting at the same time?
Well, you can phase in income splitting. You don't have to start with the whole shebang at one time. You can start with a smaller amount and then grow it over time. And of course, you can always introduce it after the next election. In fact, promise it in a budget prior to an election. So it all depends what the politician may decide to do.
You are sounding more and more like a political cynic nowadays, now that you've moved to Calgary.
Well, would I be politically cynical? Not at all.
Now, how many different proposals, I guess, are there out there? Yours presumes a family with children. Others presume a family without children. Any number of in between as well?
Well, I think the best examples is when you look around the world. So in the United States, they have what's called joint filing. A couple can elect to file together their income, and then they can take advantage of income splitting in that way. France has the most sophisticated system. Actually, I like it the most. Which is you sort of look at the family and you take all their income, you put it together, and then you divide by a quotient, and that quotient is a number that is one. Each adult is 1. This third and fourth child is 0.5.
Oh, so income splitting can reach out to children as well.
That's right, and so then you put it all in the family income, and then you divide that income by the quotient, and then you apply the progressive rate structure, and then you multiply that number by the quotient again. That gets the total family bill, in a sense. What's nice about that, you don't have to deal with attribution rules and all sorts of other complexities in the income tax system, because if a parent gives money to their child, it's automatically included in family income. So there's a significant simplification in that way.
Those on the opposite side of the fiscal spectrum, if I can put it that way, who are not necessarily looking for ways for people to pay less tax because they actually don't want to shrink government. They want to have buoyant revenues to pay for the social programs that people who want their tax cuts also say they want. They want to pay less tax and they want to have more social programs. May have an issue with you on this. What would you say to them?
Well, first of all, I've always had the view that you got to understand what base you want first. Now, some people might disagree with family taxation and don't like it. I happen to like it. I always liked it ever since I was a a little graduate student reading the Carter Report many years ago, and I do think that it is the right principle to pursue, and then what one does is maybe try to move towards that direction. So that's why I've liked the proposal. But there are people that would object to it. One objection, which I think is a fair objection, and that's really what our particular proposal deals with, is the fact that if a spouse does decide to go to work, they face a much higher level of taxation under income splitting than they would under no income splitting, and that's because they've already had some income attributed to them, and so if they go out and work, they end up paying a lot more tax as a result.
So that's a disincentive to go get a job.
That's right, but we fixed that problem in our proposal, and the way we fixed it is that if a family decides to income split, then right now what is permitted is that if there is a single earner family, the single earner can claim a personal exemption that the other spouse gets. It's called the equivalent to married exemption. Includes if there's just a single parent, includes a child, and we would no longer allow that to be transferable. What it means is that if a secondary worker goes and decides to go into the workforce, if the spouse decides to work, then they would actually be able then to claim that personal exemption. So it becomes almost like an employment tax credit. And that actually, in what we show, actually deals with that particular criticism very well.
Does this economist have a view on whether only married couples should be able to do this, or whether people who are, I say merely, in inverted commas, living together, whether they should get it too?
I think in our view, we're totally agnostic. And in fact, whatever the law says, we would permit. So if, let's say, you have a gay couple with children, they would also be permitted to income split, at least in our view. We have no reason to say that that should be any more disallowed compared to a married family of a woman and a man. That's
pure economics, but of course, I presume there would be social conservatives in Canada who would say this should be for married couples, meaning heterosexual man-woman only. Your view on that?
Well, I have a particular view as other people. I don't have a problem in the way that we define families today, including the way that we do look at marriage between, let's say, two men and two women. And so I would say that if the law certainly allows that, then I don't see any problem with allowing income splitting to be allowed as well.
Do any provinces do this in Canada?
Actually, right now, most of the provinces have tax agreements with the federal government, except for Quebec. And as a result, they agree to use the base that the federal government permits. So when the federal government brought in pension income splitting, and most of the provinces had to follow pension income splitting too, to keep the base similar to what was the federal base under the tax collection agreements. I would presume the provinces will also have to follow along. In the case of Quebec, that would be their decision whether they do it or not. Many times they often follow what the federal government does, but not always.
Okay, we're going to call the final chapter, our last 5 minutes here of this discussion, Turning the Clock Back, ? Income splitting has been proposed before, and critics say it's designed to keep women at home. Why don't I just start with that? What's your view on that? And then I'm going to read you another comment from somebody else.
Well, society's changing in many ways. And let me just make two comments on that particular point. It's not entirely clear that we're now talking about women staying at home. It could be a man staying at home. And there has been changes occurring, in fact, in the US much more rapidly in Canada. But the other point is that there's been some studies done, particularly in the United Kingdom, that have shown that the two areas where households are particularly sensitive to tax rates in terms of whether the decision to work or not. One place is a retirement decision, and the other place is when the children grow up and whoever's at home raising those children decide to, particularly when they go into school, whether they should work or not. And so I think our proposal would be, especially with the twist that we include in it, would actually go a long way in actually providing some incentive and fair treatment for dual income families, but at the same time for spouses that do decide to go into the workforce and work at that point in time.
You know Armine Yalnizyan, yes, from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. She had this to say in the Globe and Mail. She said, "We may all long for a world where there is always someone to take care of things at home and there is steady, comfortable income coming through the door, but we can't turn back the clock. Today's reality is that it's harder for young families to get into and stay in the middle class. Today, with rare exceptions, it takes two to do it. We need policies that meaningfully address that reality." I mean, open question, I guess, as to whether or not what you've proposed, quote unquote, turns back the clock. What do you say?
I don't think so, especially with the twist that we put in with regard to this treatment of the personal exemption, which actually operates as an employment tax credit. I would actually argue the opposite, that we are creating complete neutrality between those who wish to stay at home, to raise children, and those that don't. And in today's society, I think we should let people make those decisions. I don't think it should be subject to any one person wanting to make those decisions for them.
But the suggestion, I guess, in this economic climate is it's really, really, really hard to be a single income household nowadays. You need two incomes to be able to do the things that families want to do, and that the focus of our tax policy ought to be on that as opposed to what you've focused it on.
Well, I think that's kind of illogical, right? Because what we're saying is that it's harder for a spouse to stay at home to raise children, and yet here we have a significant tax penalty that makes it more difficult. Why not remove the tax penalty, and there will be some people that will have more freedom in making those decisions. I think also we have to look at the data and try to understand better who are the people that are at least can be affected and be willing to make those kinds of decisions about choosing whether to stay at home or to go to work. So, lots of comments are made, but I would like to base it more on hard fact rather than just supposition.
Okay, one last thing, and that is Canada, I think, prides itself on having a relatively progressive tax system. And would your proposal undo any of the progressivity of our tax code?
No, I don't think so. Again, it goes back to the point that what we want to do is measure the base correctly. So if we like the principle of family taxation, and that's the issue. Some people don't like it, and that's fine. But if you like the principle of family taxation and a move towards it, then this is quite appropriate to do in terms of getting the base right. How you then determine the rate structure can be a choice made by governments very easily. And I think it's very important not to mess up how we decide on the base and confuse it with the rate structure. And we do that too many times with other issues as well. And I think we need to get back to first principles of taxation and try to get equal and fair treatment across different families, taking also into account disability costs that people might have and all sorts of other issues. These things really should be considered in terms of how we measure a person's income and what they're able to cover. And then we apply the graduated rate structure quite appropriately and then decide how much tax to be paid by people.
Understood. That's Jack Mintz, Director of the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. As always, thanks for visiting us here at TVO.
My pleasure.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.